Dr. Daniel Amen is a psychiatrist, brain imaging expert, best-selling author, and medical director of the Amen Clinics. He has pioneered the use of brain imaging in clinical psychiatric practice and is a noted expert in the field of the brain and behavior. Dr. Amen's breakthrough research and insights provide hope and more effective treatment for millions of people today.
There are many people who are anxious or depressed or obsessive, prone to anger, they have attentional problems, and they thought their problems were all in their head, purely psychological, if you will. In the research that I've done, what we found is that these and many other problems are brain-based problems, and that when we optimize the brain, their lives become better. We often say, change your brain, change your life, and that's what we've seen. We're going to talk about intimacy and brain science. I like this title. One of my friends, after she learned about my work, whenever she dates a new guy, this is her motto: is this brain for me? So not only does she look at how cute he is and what kind of job he has, she looks at his brain and the evidence, the outward evidence of how his brain works. So we're going to talk about the brain and relationships. Oscar Wilde said, "The great sins of the world take place in the brain." And I'm hoping, as you learn more and more about the work that we talk about, that you believe that when your brain works right, you work right, and when there's trouble between your ears, there's trouble in your life. But he goes on to say, it is in the brain that everything takes place. It is in the brain that poppies are golden, that apples smell sweet, that the skylark sings, and I added, and that we love or hate each other. It's in the brain. So as you think about it, what are the requirements for a good relationship? Well, as I thought about it, and I've thought about this a lot because I've treated many, many couples through the years, and I've been in one or two relationships myself. The first requirement of a good relationship is you have to be able to listen. You have to be able to pay attention to another person besides yourself. And it's mutuality. It's not just my way all the time. Sometimes it's your way. And we can give and take. It's about being flexible. Can I roll with the changes of the day? About having tact, thoughtfulness, being able to inhibit that first response that comes in your head. That first response that flashes in your mind. You're a jerk. To be able to inhibit that and not just say the first thing that comes into your mind. To have passion. Good relationships require energy, affection, forgiveness, consistency, focus, trust, support, time. When I lecture and talk about parent training, I talk about bonding, listening, and time, actual physical time, compassion, and shared goals. Is the brain involved in any of these? If we look at it, the brain's role in relationships, clearly it's involved in listening. If you have an auditory processing problem because your temporal lobes don't work right, you might not hear what somebody else says. It's involved in mutuality, being able to have empathy for somebody else. It's a frontal lobe function. Wipe out somebody's frontal lobes and they won't care what you think, even though they love you and they want to be in a good relationship with you. Have a hot cingulate, you're rigid, inflexible. Things don't go your way, you're really upset. You can imagine how that might interfere with relationships. Tact is a frontal lobe. Being able to think about what you say before you say it. Think about what you do before you do it. Impulse control just kills love and relationships. Passion and affection, those are limbic phenomenons, critical to relationships. But if your limbic system is fired up, you have issues with depression. And you're not interested in sex, and you're not interested in being touched. If you've been traumatized, you've been sexually abused, you have post-traumatic stress disorder, and your whole brain is on fire, you're going to have trouble with an intimate relationship. You'll have trouble, one, forgiving those people that hurt you, and two, trusting those new people that come in your life. Consistency is a frontal lobe, focus is a frontal lobe issue. Trust, support, time, compassion, shared goals, a lot having to do with the front part of the brain. So, some brain basics as they're involved with relationships. So, and the first basic is your brain's involved in everything you do. How you think, how you feel, how you act, how you dance, how well you get along with other people has to do with the moment-by-moment functioning of your brain. That's what we're going to focus on today, is interactions. Your brain determines the kind of spouse that you are. Are you the spouse that's consistent, predictable, loving? Your brain works right. Odds are. The kind of friend that you are, the kind of child, parent, the kind of lover that you are has to do with brain function. I mean, if you just think about coordination, it has to do with the cerebellum, right? And if your cerebellum has a tumor in it, or a cyst, or it's been hurt in an accident, or hurt by encephalitis, rhythm's not going to be very good, so you'll have trouble. Dancing, for example. The next one is real simple, but it's one of the major principles our work is based on, and that is when your brain works right, you work right. And when your brain doesn't, there's a lot of trouble in relationships. And a lot of people who do marital counseling never think about the brain. I mean, how do you do that? See, I have no idea how you do that without actually thinking about brain science. The image on the left is a healthy brain. The image on the right is a heroin brain. So what do you think heroin addicts are like in relationships? A lot of trouble. And you have a lot of trouble trusting them because they don't have consistent access to a healthy brain. The third is the brain is the most complicated organ in the universe. Nothing as complicated as the human brain, nothing. It's estimated you have 100 billion neurons. Each neuron, nerve cells connected to other neurons, by up to 40,000 individual connections between cells. So it means you have more cells and more connections in your brain than there are stars in the universe. And even though it's only 2% of your weight, it uses 20 to 30% of the calories you consume. So when you think about loving people, I mean, we think about loving people with our hearts. You got to wonder where that came from. Because you don't love anybody with your heart. Your heart's a muscle. It's a pump. You love people with your brain. So this Valentine's Day for my sweetie. So I went to Tiffany's. And I'm going to find her the coolest looking brain possible. But they didn't have one. It's like, where did we get this? I love you with my heart. It's not true. You love people with your brain, and when your brain doesn't work right, there's trouble. Also, the brain is very soft. It's about the consistency of soft butter or a raw egg. It is really soft, and it's housed in a really hard skull, and the skull has ridges in it. Now, what does that mean? It means that mild traumatic brain injuries change your whole life, and nobody knows about it. So if mild brain injuries change your whole life, what do you think severe brain injuries do? I mean, they cause people to get divorced. They're heavily involved in domestic violence. They're involved in child abuse. Now, on the surface, when bad things like that happens, like domestic violence happens, we blame the perpetrator and have great empathy for the person who's been abused. And we don't really help the situation because we put these guys, mostly guys, in classes that shame them without really good evaluation. And it's sort of not fair if you understand it through the lens of brain science. That doesn't mean they're not responsible. But what it means is we should help them effectively by at least understanding this piece of the puzzle. My experience, I used to be the chief of the domestic violence department at Fort Irwin when I was the chief psychiatrist there. It's a little place in the Mojave Desert. It's like 6 people out of 10 involved with domestic violence we could see significant brain injuries with. So what are the neurotransmitters of love? What are the chemicals of love? Well, dopamine is the neurotransmitter that makes you fall in love. Dopamine is like the juice. It's what's really dominating the first month that you're in love with someone. It's what makes your heart go fast, makes you obsessive. You can't stop thinking about them. You're focused on them. It's dopamine. Actually, I've done studies when you just fall in love, dopamine goes up and serotonin goes down. And when serotonin goes down, you know, we know that's in psychiatry circles associated with obsessive compulsive disorder. So when you just fall in love, it's sort of like you have subclinical OCD. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter mostly involved in memory. And when you have an emotional charge, when you look in somebody's eyes and you can't stop looking, well, when you can get an emotional charge with something, your memory gets attached to it. That's why if students love their teachers, they do better in class. So anytime you get an emotional charge, those are the things that you really remember because it's also associated with acetylcholine. Serotonin is involved with mood and flexibility. And when serotonin levels are high, you can go with the flow. When they're really low, you get obsessive. Now that can be wonderful because a woman might fall in love with you back because you were such a good pursuer. It's like you had to have her. Well, she might not like it. If she doesn't like you, and if she doesn't like it, they then call you a stalker. So it's how two brains are really interacting with each other. Now, I don't know if anybody's seen the movie 50 Blind Dates yet. It's very sweet. And it's a brain movie. This girl had a bad car accident, and she loses her short-term memory. And so this guy, played by Adam Sandler, falls in love with her, but she doesn't remember him from day to day. And on some days, he's really sweet and she really likes him. And other days, she thinks he's a stalker. And it's very sweet and very funny. And probably worth seeing just from a brain science perspective. There is a neurotransmitter called GABA. And GABA inhibits overfiring of the brain. And so GABA is what we actually try to raise with people who have bipolar disorder. And does bipolar disorder affect relationships? You bet. It tears them up in a very destructive way. So if that neurotransmitter is low, too much is going on in your brain and you're constantly distracted. Endorphins. Endorphins are the pleasure center, the pleasure chemical of the brain. And you bet when you look in somebody's beautiful green eyes or blue eyes, endorphins are popping up in your head. Now, we'd be very careful not to have too much acupuncture at that time because acupuncture blocks endorphin production. So if you're just falling in love with somebody, save the acupuncture treatment until the love is sort of more neutral or regular. Chemicals called vasopressin and oxytocin. In men, vasopressin is involved in connection and emotion. And isn't it interesting? There are some men, they get attached to a woman, and that's the only woman that they ever want their whole life. Other men, they just don't attach. You know, they're interested in this one, and tomorrow they're interested in that one, and then, you know, they like have to have 100 before they're satiated. Now, what's the difference? Well, there's actually some fascinating research on vasopressin. They've looked at 2 different kinds of voles. They're like prairie dogs or little rodents. And there's one kind of vole that is monogamous. They make love to another vole, they're attached to that vole forever. There's another kind of vole, not monogamous at all. I mean, they sort of play the field, if you know what I mean. And they looked at their brains, and the distribution of vasopressin was very different between the monogamous voles and the playboy voles. Isn't that interesting? So if your man can't stay with you, it may not be completely 100% a choice. It may have to do with the wiring. Women are sort of, not always, but sort of less so that way, oxytocin, and it's why you shouldn't have sex with somebody you're not going to be committed to, especially if you're a woman. I mean, we can talk about the morality of it, but just from a brain science perspective, when females make love, oxytocin goes nuts in their brain, and then they get bonded and connected, which is why sex for fun just doesn't work from a brain science perspective. There's another very important concept to understand. It's called long-term potentiation. And what that means is as you learn something new, your brain makes a new connection. As you learn something again, your brain makes then a stronger connection. And as you really practice this pattern over time, your brain becomes what we call potentiated, which means then you can do that activity without even thinking because you have very strong connections. Now, when we think about this in terms of relationships, the family you grow up in, they interact in a certain way. And so if you grow up in a reasonably healthy family, your interactions, by and large, are potentiated, and you will interact with the world in a fairly healthy way. The family you grow up in is crazy. You're going to learn interactions around anxiety, around fear, and it's going to be very hard for you to, even as an adult, far removed from the craziness, to interact in a consistently loving, predictable way. That's why I don't really like short-term psychotherapy, because when you have to relearn patterns of interacting, it takes time for those patterns to be reset. Now, when we talk about relationships, you have to talk about male-female differences. I mean, that is just critical. So, men have a greater number of cells, neurons in their brain, mostly on the left side. But women have more connections and more connections between the hemispheres. The corpus callosum, the big band of white matter, so nerve cell tracts that are wrapped in myelin, is larger in some studies in women, and the corpus callosum connects the 2 hemispheres. So it allows the 2 hemispheres to talk to each other. So men tend to be more left-sided, more sort of like Sergeant Friday on Dragnet. What are the facts? Could you get to the point? Women have greater access to both sides, and so they use hunches, but they also use more language. The limbic system, emotional system, is larger in females. Very important, because that's the part of your brain that's involved with bonding. Now, guys, especially today, guys will tell you, I can be just as good a parent for my children as the child's mother. Yet, there is not one society on the face of the earth where men are primary caretakers for children. Not one. Now that's a problem. Why? Because in those animal species where the males are heavily involved with child rearing, the males live longer. One of the reasons women live 15% longer is because they're involved in child rearing, and from an evolutionary perspective, it sort of makes sense that mom's got to be around more to make sure that the next generation has support and has health. So bonding's easier for women. Women tend to have more friends than men. Women are also primary caretakers for the elderly. 70% of the time in the United States, if an elderly person is being cared for, they're being cared for by a woman. Women also have a larger nesting instinct. So their house is more important to them than it is for a man. In fact, if you went to 100 male apartments and compared them to 100 female apartments, where would you rather live? Because they're better at it. And if you move and you want to do your wife a favor, help her get the house together before you do anything else, because she will feel more settled and happier. As an Army psychiatrist, I was an Army psychiatrist for 7 years, we dealt with lots of families who moved. And often the women would get depressed for 6 months until they could get their house together, until they could get a new church, until they could get a new group of friends, until they felt bonded and connected. So, it's very important. But because a woman's limbic system is larger, that may be why she's at greater risk for depression. You look at the studies on depression, women experience depression twice as much as men. And it starts to really increase after puberty. So there's a huge hormonal component, and what we'll talk about a little bit later is PMS. And what do the brains look like at different times of the cycle? Because there are a lot of hormonal receptors in the limbic parts of the brain. I don't know if you know, but depression is the #1 reason why women are hospitalized after having a baby. The #1 medical illness reason why they are hospitalized from the ages of 18 to 44. This is no small problem in our country. For men, they're usually better at direction sense because the inferior parietal lobe, bottom of the parietal lobe, especially on the left side, is usually larger. It's the part of your brain that estimates time, judges speed, visualizes objects in 3D so you can fly a kite or throw a football, is involved in solving math. Larger in men on the left side. So they're usually, not always, but usually better at directions. Women, it's larger on the right side, so they usually know when they're lost. So women are much better at asking for help. Now, when you're working with couples, you will notice 9 times out of 10 that the wife is calling or the girlfriend is calling because she gets it, that there's a problem. And guys don't get it, and it's because of the difference in hemisphere. So let's talk about that a little bit. Because men tend to be more left-sided, women tend to be more both-sided, but more on the right side. The left side has gotten a bad rap. I mean, we almost talk about left hemisphere as it's uptight and Republican. And we talk about the right hemisphere as it is this warm, special, creative, living in Santa Monica or Marin County kind of, left-wing, liberal part of the brain. And the fact is the left side is probably responsible for human success because it is more logical and more analytical and more involved with long-term goals. The right side, however, is critical because it gets the big picture of a situation and is more holistic. So just in looking at the left hemisphere, think of it, it's the detail part of the brain involved in analysis and calculations, communication, breaks down complicated patterns into their component parts. It's time sensitive. Now think about complicated patterns. It sees the trees. The right hemisphere sees the forest. So if you're at a party, the left hemisphere is going to see the color red, and it's going to see the fabric silk. And it's the right hemisphere that's going to go, party dress. Whoa, very nice. So you need both. Right? I mean, when we think of people who are very left brain, we think of electrical engineers or accountants. And these are not people that generally get that excited with party dresses. Right? So, these are also not the people in the theater, as actors or actresses. Left hemisphere, logical, precise, detail-oriented, conceives and executes plans. That's why many artists who are more right hemisphere have a lot of projects they start and a lot of projects they don't finish. Right? Left hemisphere is, let's get this done. And this is the deadline. It's your boss at work who gives you a project and gives you a deadline to have it done by. Those cells in the left hemisphere, they're closer together, more densely woven. And that's why we think men have 4% more neurons, because the left hemisphere is more developed. The right hemisphere, critical because it gets the big picture, sees the gestalt. Remember, there's a whole therapy. Let me do gestalt therapy with you, which is all about getting sort of the big picture of the situation. It's involved in sensory perception. The right side is negative. It's sort of sad and blue. It's fearful, mournful. So if you really want to get your way with somebody, get to their right side. Because if you stand to their right, you are more heavily processed in the left side of their brain, the happy side of their brain. They've actually done research with this and find that salesmen are significantly more effective depending on where they stand. And many lecturers will just naturally gravitate over to the student's right side because the students smile more, they nod more, they pay attention more. So I think, thinking about it in relationships, if you want to kiss her, you should kiss the right side of her neck because it'll be processed more on the left side of her brain and she'll be more happy with you. So it'd be an interesting research project. Now, as I said, the right side is also more pessimistic. It's dreamier in its approach. It recognizes faces, which is critical. There's actually one study in Italy where a shepherd damaged his right temporal lobe, and he did not recognize his sheep. I guess shepherds know their sheep. So it's involved with hunches, sees patterns at a glance. It helps to look at the different layers of images. So it'll help you see camouflaged images against a complex background. Think about it at night. You're going out to your car at the mall, and there's shadows. Well, it helps you sort of see through the shadows. There's more white matter in the right side of the brain because neurons are connected from farther apart. So the brain will draw on different modules at the same time. So it'll come up with these complex, multifaceted, broad, but vague concepts. So you can see why you really need both sides together. There's a syndrome called alien hand syndrome. Some of you have probably heard about it, where the hemispheres get disconnected and then they start fighting with each other. So I had one patient, she would always be very late to work because she'd go in and she'd grab a business suit to put on, and then her other hand would put it back and grab a party dress. So she couldn't sort of figure out what she wanted to wear. So it was like she'd get hemispheres. This is internal conflict. So when Freud talked about, psychic conflict, he's really talking about conflict between the hemispheres. All right, so why should you look at the brain in relationships? Well, because one, the brain is complicated. Hopefully we've learned that by now. Two, we need better diagnostic tools, better understanding of the problem. You have a couple coming to see you. It's like, what is it? Now, if you're dealing with couple problems, it's really good to meet both people. Too often, therapists end up siding with one person or the other without ever have seen the other person. And your perception of that other person may be dramatically different if you spend 2 or 3 hours with them. So it's often very helpful. Imaging helps you, hopefully you know this by now, compassion and understanding. It helps the partners have more understanding for each other. If this person is abusing me, well, I just think he's a jerk. And then I look at his brain and see brain damage because, you know, he was a roofer and he fell off a roof, or got hit in the head with a baseball bat, or he went through the windshield of a car. Well, now you have more empathy. You're not as bitter. You're not as, you don't hate him as much. An old friend who actually went here, she read my book, Change Your Brain, Change Your Life. And one of the things she does is work with foster children. And she said after reading the book helped her soften her heart. It was like the coolest thing anybody told me on that book. But that's what it does. It helps soften your heart so that you can forgive. Increases compliance. You bet I need to go get some help for this so I can have a better brain. And decreases stigma. As you know, we do this study called brain SPECT imaging. Looks at blood flow and activity patterns, and we've been doing it for a long time. This month going over our 20,000th scan. So it makes me feel really old. But many of them are with couples. And I'll share with you my first couple that I did in 1991. The pictures you're going to see are really easy to understand because we look for 3 things. Areas of good activity, too little, or too much. And the whole goal of treatment, from my perspective, is balancing your brain. Because I figure you probably know how to do your life. If I can get your brain balanced, you're likely to do much better. So, in a clinical way, when should you think about doing a scan? There's a history of brain trauma. If they have cognitive decline, if they have blood vessel disease in their brain, or seizures, or epilepsy, they're violent, suicidal. This person has a temper problem. I saw somebody yesterday who had temper problems. Things didn't go his way. Exploded. What the imaging did is it helped the wife stop divorce proceedings. She didn't invite him back home yet. He lives in a motorhome. They call it the doghouse. Dad's doghouse. But hopefully as we balance his brain, he'll be able to go back home. Toxic exposure. One of the scans that is the most interesting to me is a guy whose brain looked like a heroin brain, but it was because of where he worked. And he came to us from his marital therapist because he had a bad temper and couldn't pay attention and had bad judgment. Looking at things like ADD, anxiety, depression, if it's not simple, if it's not getting better with standard treatments, you think about imaging. Or if they have something that's just, you don't know what it is or it's resistant to treatment. So looking at a healthy brain, as you know, we look at it in 2 different ways. The outside surface, full, even, symmetrical activity. Image on the left looks down from the top, and you should see, whether you're 5 or 85, you should see a beautiful brain. An image on the right is looking up from the bottom. Again, full, even, symmetrical activity. And we also look at the hot spots in the brain. And the hot spots in the brain cause lots of relationship problems. So here blue is average activity, red is the top 15%. Mostly in the cerebellum, the back part of the brain. Why? Because it has 50% of the brain's neurons. Only 10% of the brain's volume, but 50% of the brain's neurons. So it's a very important part. So if we want to look at the systems, brain systems involved in relationships, we have to look at the brain systems involved with behavior. So let's talk about those. So this is a diagram just looking at the systems. PFC is the prefrontal cortex. TL is the temporal lobes. Cerebellum at the back bottom part of the brain. So we will look at these. Again, just looking at the outside surface of the brain. PFC is the prefrontal cortex. If your Prefrontal cortex is having trouble working, you're having trouble in relationships. I mean, you just have to think it's the supervisor. It watches you. So looking at the prefrontal cortex, now if we look at its functions, think of executive functions: internal supervision, attention span, judgment, impulse control, organization, planning, forethought. Anybody think this is related to love and your ability to be in a consistently predictable relationship? You bet, because if you look at the problems, short attention span. Intimacy requires attention. One of the neatest things I do is treat people with ADD. I love that. And when you treat women who have ADD, one of the most interesting side effects is that when you put them on a stimulant and they can concentrate, they have better orgasms. Why? Because what does an orgasm require? Concentration. You have to pay attention to the feeling. I mean, what if you're always getting distracted? It's hard. They come back a couple of weeks later and they have these big smiles and they say, I just want to thank you. I feel good. But I don't go home and say, oh, I helped this woman have an orgasm today. See, that would be bad judgment. Impulse control. So if you're impulsive, how might that hurt a relationship? You have affairs. You say stupid things that hurt people's feelings. You spend money. You procrastinate. You think that'll irritate your partner? Put things off, put things off, put things off. You bet. Disorganized. Your house is a mess, and you're married to somebody who likes things neat. Do you think that would cause conflict? Big conflict. Bad judgment. They also can be negative seeking or conflict seeking. Oh my goodness. They play this game called Let's Have a Problem. And so you can take a very nice evening and ruin it, or a very nice weekend and ruin it, or a very nice vacation and ruin it, or a very nice marriage and ruin it, because they always are fighting with somebody. It's just, and you see them in psychotherapy, because they start picking on the therapist. And it's like no matter where they go, they're in a fight. So some conditions associated with low activity in the prefrontal cortex, clearly ADHD. Schizophrenia can be, antisocial personality disorder, trauma, and frontal temporal lobe dementia. So a disease usually in the elderly of a deteriorating frontal lobe. These is where people who had good judgment throughout their life, now they have really bad judgment. It can be a severe problem. And if we looked at an ADHD brain, what we see is it's relatively normal at rest, which is the image on the left, and it drops with concentration. So what does that mean? The harder they try, the worse it gets, but it's also why they're conflict seeking. Let me stimulate it. And if I can get you to yell at me, I feel better. You feel worse, I feel better. It's the prescription for a divorce. Antisocial personality disorders often pretty severe damage to the frontal lobes. So they don't care, they don't think, they don't have empathy, and they don't have enough anxiety. Do relationships need some anxiety? Of course. And you want to be a little bit worried that your partner's happy, because you want to be paying attention to their needs. If you just don't care, you can go off with anybody and it doesn't bother you. Okay, so problems in the prefrontal cortex. How about the cingulate gyrus, especially the front part of the anterior cingulate gyrus? It's involved in cognitive flexibility, being able to go with the flow, shifting attention, seeing options, being cooperative. All right, so if there are problems here, basically they're not flexible. Think of that as the primary issue. Clinically, you'll see that they worry, they hold grudges. Now, is grudge holding an issue in relationships? I mean, if you're still bringing up stuff that your husband did when you were dating, and you have a 20-year-old child, It's very bad. Right? It's like you can't let go. They get stuck on thoughts. I mean, it could be an obsessive thought. Or it could be your husband said something insensitive to you, like husbands do. But he said it once. In your mind, you heard it 1,000 times. Do you think that will affect the relationship? Oh my goodness. She can never let anything go. They get stuck on behaviors, can be compulsive behaviors, or it can be they just have to have things their way. And that's what gets relationships into trouble a lot. It's that inflexibility. It's not mutuality. I have to have my way. If I don't have my way, I'm going to throw a tantrum. And if I'm bright, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to explain to you why I have to have my way. Right? I mean, if they're really intelligent, they'll come up with these elaborate, logical explanations, but basically they're not flexible. It's like, what's the goal? Well, the goal is to have a good relationship. Well, if you want to have a good relationship, you can't have your way all the time. Addictions, we'll talk about that. You think addictions tear up families? Oh, like nothing else. And people who are oppositional and argumentative. What do I mean by that? They say no. Their starting answer is always no. Go to the store with me. No. Could you get the clothes at the cleaners? No. Could we have this for dinner? No. Can we make love? No. Do that on a regular basis, your chance of getting divorced is 90%. And nobody knows that this could be a brain thing, that their starting position is no because their cingulate gyrus is too hot. I grew up with somebody, my dad is very much, his starting position in life was no. And we finally got his scan at the age of 74. I mean, I was after him for 12 years. And there his cingulate gyrus was. And I just knew it. And it just, there's a part of me that just relaxed. It's like I knew it just wasn't me. I asked him, I said, why are you like that? See, because, now I'm almost 50, I can do that, right? You can't do that as a child. Why are you? He said, it's just easier to start with no. If somebody really wants something, they'll fight with you until they get it. And I'm like, what a way to live. Okay, so all of these conditions can be as a result of too much activity in the cingulate gyrus, from anxiety where you get stuck, from trauma where you get stuck on that, obsessive compulsive disorder, eating disorders, addictions, oppositional defiant disorder. You'll see them in your office. And no matter what it is you say, it's like they wear Teflon. No matter what it is you say, it bounces off them. And it's like they don't really get it. They don't really process it. And at the end of 3 months, at a moment when your frontal lobes are not working that hard, you'll go, it seems like no matter what it is I say to you, you argue with me. And you know what they'll say? No, I don't. At which point, the only thing I want you to do is smile and say, well, that's how it seems to me. And they'll argue with you. And you go, well, I want you to watch it this week. My guess is your automatic tendency, no matter what people say to you, is to argue with it. Now, I know you don't think you do it, but I just want you to pay attention to it this week, and we'll talk about it next week. And 8 times out of 10 in my experience, they come back and they go, I do that. And then I go, do you want to do that? And they say, what do you mean? I said, do you want to be a chronically difficult person that argues with everybody? No. No, it's your automatic tendency. Know that. And before you say it, take a big breath and ask yourself, does it help me to say it? So in looking at the scans, if we look at someone who has obsessive compulsive disorder, this is one of my patients, just see dramatic hyperactivity in the cingulate, also usually in the basal ganglia. If you look at road rage, I could also put a brain of a stalker. It would be very similar. What is it? They get stuck and they can't shift, even though it's clearly not in anybody's best interest. They can't let go. And the time of your cycle matters. I mean, this is the most interesting thing about what I do. I have 5 sisters. So I was very interested in what the brain looks like. And when I was married, my wife, at certain times of her cycle, would look at me with such love. I mean, she'd like look at the hair on my forearms and, oh, you're so cool. And then, you know, like a week later, she's very neutral on me. And then for about 10 days, nothing I did was right. I mean, I used to plan my travel schedule around her menstrual cycle. So I started, when I was hearing this in my practice, I'm like, we're going to scan you at the good time of your cycle and at the bad time of your cycle. And it was like people had multiple personality disorder. It's like, oh my goodness, it was so different. So PMS is a real thing. So when we scan people, we actually ask them, where are you in your menstrual cycle, and do you have any PMS-like symptoms? Okay, so this is Sally on cingulate gyrus problems. She says to her brother, Charlie Brown, no, that's my new philosophy. I don't care what anyone says, the answer is no. That's your new philosophy, huh? Charlie Brown says, yes. I mean, no, you ruined my new philosophy. And that's where they're at. It's never their fault. It's your fault. And it's your fault, and it's your fault. It's not my fault. I didn't do anything. I mean, I'm like as good as they get. Very hard to live with somebody like that because they never own the problem. And then you have the basal ganglia. This is my brain. My basal ganglia are always active. It integrates feeling and movement. That's why you jump when you get excited, or in my case, freeze when you get scared. Modulates anxiety, controls smooth motor movement, very involved with motivation. It's where dopamine is produced in the brain. And when they work too hard, you can have anxiety, panic, be conflict avoidant, predict the worst, work too much. Now, how would that affect relationships? Well, if you're anxious and panicky, well, maybe you have agoraphobia and you don't leave the house. That'll affect your relationship if your husband wants to go to ball games and you'll never go with him because you're afraid of crowds. You bet that'll affect relationships. Or many of my patients through the years, they wouldn't drive and their husband had to take them to work and pick them up. I had one person who worked in Oakland, the other one worked in South San Francisco, and if you know anything about the traffic in the Bay Area, I mean, it was an extra 2.5 hours every day just because she couldn't drive. So, less time for fun. If you're conflict avoidant, how does that affect relationships? See, I have this really crazy belief that we teach other people how to treat us. That means if you're conflict avoidant and your husband yells at you, and you don't go, I don't like it when you yell at me. You can't yell at me. If you just withdraw, and you basically teach him it's okay to yell at you, you'll actually make his behavior worse because you can't deal with the conflict. See how that makes it trouble? And I've watched, you know, person after person in relationships shape the behavior of their spouse to be much more negative than it needed to be because they couldn't assert themselves. Predicting the worst, that could affect relationships. I mean, one, it'll affect your problem with commitment. You know, it's like, I don't know any marriages that are happy. I can't get married. Right? I mean, you predict it in a bad way. Right? Or you're going to get sick, die, and leave me, so better not to be attached. Or, you know, you'll be like these people I see on TV and, you know, take me for all the money I have like Donald Trump, although he doesn't seem like he's doing that badly. If you predict the worst, you are anxious, tense, and I think you actually make things worse. You know, there's a condition called pseudocyesis. You heard what that is? It's a fascinating condition. It means false pregnancy. That is where a woman believes that she is pregnant. even though she's not. Her body actually begins to take on the shape of a pregnant woman. Her belly gets big, she stops menstruating, her breasts get larger. Sometimes she'll even lactate or produce milk. I've treated it 4 times in my practice. It's fascinating. But what it really teaches me is your mind matters. Your mind is very powerful, and if you are predicting the worst, you'll make it happen. Right? I mean, if you come home and you go, the house won't be picked up, things will be disorganized, dinner won't be ready. If you do that whole number in your head, when you get home, the first thing you see out of place, right? Everything might be just as you expected. The first thing out of place, you fly off the handle. And then you predicting that you were having a bad evening, you bet. You had a bad evening. In part because your mind, your brain, set it up that way. Now, if they're decreased basal ganglia, you can have ADD-like symptoms. You have problems with energy, motivation, and so on. If you're not motivated, that could affect your relationship, right? A lot of the successful women that I've treated through the years were married to men that were not motivated. Now, I know that's not always true. I'm just telling you about the people who come in to see me, and it just infuriates them, right? And maybe they weren't always like that. It could have been a brain injury or stroke or something that changed their behavior. It's a woman that has a panic disorder. But increased basal ganglia activity also goes with muscle tension. Honey, I have a headache. That'll affect relationships. They have more headaches, more stomach aches, more back aches. And, the muscles in your vagina, the muscles in your penis, they all respond to anxiety, right? Vagismus is a term for a woman whose female organs clamp down. I mean, like you can get a stomach cramp, or you can get cramps in the back of your neck. Well, you can get that in your genitals as well. It's a huge negative impact on sexual function. Well, what about your temporal lobes? Can they be involved in relationships? You bet. They're involved with language, memory, mood stability, temper control, listening, reading social cues, music, rhythm, and spiritual experience. Say you have a really well-developed right temporal lobe. So your spiritual life is very rich. Say you're married to somebody who has no function in their right temporal lobe, and they don't know and don't care. Anybody see that in their churches? You bet. That causes often serious problems if your spirituality is not matched. Now, when there are temporal lobe problems, emotional instability, I can't predict how he's going to be. Memory problems, she forgets. I ask her to do something, she forgets. Sometimes they have the feelings of panic or fear for no particular reason out of the blue. I have treated one patient, she'd go on a trip and halfway, she'd be at the airport in Chicago, have a panic attack and have to come home. So like they spent $15,000 on this trip to Kenya and she had to go home. Aggression, externally, I'm going to hurt you. Many domestic violence cases are involved with temporal lobe problems, our experience. I just testified last week in a case in Oregon where this boy, normal, till 16, had a bad car accident. And then irritable, he had 4 suicide attempts. His last suicide attempt, he went over to his ex-girlfriend's house. He was going to blow his brains out in front of her. A little histrionic. It's what you get with no frontal lobes. And she was there with her new boyfriend, and it was a very bad scene. He had her tie him up. He then raped her and held her at gunpoint, and the police came, and finally, he let everybody go, and they ended up arresting him. And they basically, this is the only criminal act he's ever done. I mean, it was really awful, but they wanted to put him away for 21 years. And I testified because I had his brain. And as I showed his brain, he had severe damage in his left temporal lobe. That's the part we often see involved with violence. Very sad. Because he actually went to treatment, and they gave him stuff that would make him worse. I mean, that I would have predicted would have made him worse, because they didn't scan him and had no clue he had a left temporal lobe problem. The scan that you see is actually of somebody from Normal, Illinois, who came to see us after he'd been arrested for felony domestic violence. And the arrow points to severe damage to his left temporal lobe when he was 6 years old. He was standing on top of a rail, and he fell head first 6 feet into a pile of bricks. And always since then had problems with his temper. And he hated himself. I mean, I remember the day I first saw him, he wept because he hated himself. I don't know why I act like this. I don't want to act like this. I know I'm going to lose my wife. I just hate myself. And he could see the scan and start to, 1, understand, 2, to get the right help, and 3, to forgive himself. Lots of things can affect the temporal lobes, like learning disabilities, dementia, epilepsy. And you have anybody that's aggressive, you should be thinking about temporal lobe issues. And trauma, because the temporal lobes sit right behind a very sharp bone in your skull called the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. This is a woman we saw who actually her head never hit anything. She was rear-ended by an 18-wheel truck. What happened inside her skull is her brain bounced severe back and forth and caused temporal lobe problems. And her issues were memory. She lost her ability to read, and her temper was terrible. She is a dentist and would actually throw things in the office. Another person who's one of our domestic violence cases had a severe diving accident, and these are the scans before and after treatment. I mean, how exciting is that? You know, I'm working on this TV show. I think I mentioned it, the Extreme Makeover Brain Edition, right? To see if we can change your brain, to change your life. Okay. Now, the last part to talk about is the emotional centers in the brain, the limbic system, which involves a number of different structures, but they allow information into your brain. They set your emotional tone, how happy or sad you are, involving bonding, connection, stores highly charged emotional memories. Your sense of smell is there. And your libido is there. And we know smell and libido are connected. The perfume industry is built on that, right? You want to make your man more amorous, cook with cinnamon. Cinnamon is a natural aphrodisiac for women. If you want to make your woman more amorous, put baby powder on. Baby powder increases libido in women significantly by increasing vaginal blood flow by 15%. See, all of the major men's colognes decrease vaginal blood flow. Don't waste your money. When you go to the car wash and they go, what scent do you want in the car? Have you ever done that and they want to know what scent? Baby powder. That's it. And why? Because women associate baby powder to babies, and then they want one, and their body sort of gets ready for the whole scene about it. But when your limbic brain is fired up, you get sad, you get moody, you get emotional, you get negative. You have a lot of what we call ANTs, automatic negative thoughts. Low motivation, you become more isolated, so you don't want to go out. You don't want to spend time around people. You lose your libido. It's a woman that had severe postpartum depression, increased limbic activity. Another person with increased limbic and increased cingulate. So here we're looking underneath the brain. You can see the arrow is pointing to the limbic part of the brain, but toward the top is the cingulate gyrus. So sad and can't let it go. So lots of negative thoughts that they then get stuck on. An example of a bipolar brain, overall increased activity. That's why they can't stop talking, can't stop moving, don't need to sleep. spend money that they don't have, may become hypersexual, hyper-religious. They're just different than they were before. So, in relationship counseling, take a brain science history. We have a brain system checklist that's up on the website. It's useful to just see, is it frontal, is it basal ganglia, limbic, temporal, cingulate? And if you don't know, that's when you should think about looking. Well, what about these different psychiatric disorders? How might they impact relationships? If we just look at anxiety, when we talked about some of the things, you're tense. You predict the worst. Fortune telling is the hallmark of anxiety disorders. You're insecure. You don't love me. So you'll have issues with commitment and attachment. If you're depressed, you're sad, blue, negative, and you have no joy, no hope. You feel worthless. And if you feel worthless, you also feel unlovable. So connection is going to be very hard. People who have depression get divorced significantly more than the general population. And the general population gets divorced 50% of the time, right? So it increases it even above that. If you have ADD, well, I have to tell you, I was married to somebody who has ADD for a long time. I know more about this from a relationship standpoint than I want to know. But the conflict-seeking behavior, the disorganization, I mean, I'm praying God forgives me, but I lied to that woman all the time. Because she just couldn't get any place on time. So I could you be there at 8:30? And she'd show up at 9, frazzled, and it was like, okay, we can do this. But it's very difficult because ADD is associated with chronic stress. And treating it doesn't necessarily fix everything. If we just sort of look at the classic ADD brain, pretty good at rest, drops with concentration. Now with treatment, usually it gets a lot better. So that's why treating it, not only do you help them with their orgasm, but you help them with things like forethought and judgment, impulse control, organization, and planning. What about OCD spectrum disorders? If we look at obsessive compulsive disorder, if you're vacuuming the house at 11 o'clock at night while your wife is waiting for you to come to bed, do you think this could affect your relationship? Maybe, right? Or if she married you and you were like 160 pounds and now you have an eating disorder and you're 400 pounds, do you think that might affect how attractive you are to her? Or the other way around? You bet. Or if you're addicted to pornography on the internet, do you think that might play a role in your relationship? You bet, especially if she's not addicted to pornography on the internet. It's very bad. We just finished a study on sexual addictions and found the most common finding was low activity in the prefrontal cortex. So that's the excitement-seeking behavior. The next most common finding was the cingulate gyrus. Compulsive gamblers, do you think that affects relationships? You blow the family's fortune? You blow somebody's security or sense of security? I mean, we really don't have any security, but their sense of security. Or what if you have Tourette's syndrome? You know what Tourette's syndrome is. It's a tic disorder where people have both motor and vocal tics. And the vocal tics sometimes can be a real problem. Sometimes they can be a real problem because you just blurt out the first most awful, terrible thing you think. It's not fun. If you have oppositional defiant disorder, no, 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 no. I have a friend who is in Washington. He said, when I saw him a while ago, he said, you know, Dan, I'm so grateful for all the things that you've taught me, especially about the cingulate gyrus. I'm married to a woman who has the cingulate from hell. And he says, it's easier now that I just know that. But before, I'd ask her to go to the store with me, and she'd yell at me and say, I can't go to the store, I'm so busy, how could you ask me that? I just wanted to go to the store with her. And he said, since listening to you, I realize I have to always ask things in the opposite. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, when I want her to go to the store with me, I say, I'm going to go to the store. You probably don't want to go with me. What do you mean I don't want to go with you? Of course I want to go with you. I love you. What would ever give you that idea? He said, it's been really helpful. He said, but the one thing I'm still not good at, it's the sex thing. He said, it doesn't sound right to say, I'm going to go have sex. You probably don't want to come with me. He said, do you have any ideas for me? And I said, well, I think about this a lot. And I said, yes, do this. Take her out for a pasta dinner, because carbs really help relax the cingulate gyrus. Take her out for a pasta dinner. Take her for a long walk around the lake, because exercise boosts serotonin levels. Go home. Give her something chocolate, because that always helps. Go in the bathroom, put baby powder on. Come out, rub her shoulders, and never ask for anything directly. And about 3 weeks later in my email box, I got thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. See, I love being a psychiatrist because you're better at manipulating people in a nice way. What if you have an autistic spectrum disorder? People don't think about autism in relationships, but you need to, because autism and autistic spectrum disorders are much more common than we think. We think of autism as issues with language, use funny words, issues with social skills, don't get social relationships, and issues with cognitive rigidity. How might that affect a relationship? Have to have your way. Don't read social situations, so you might have odd reactions. So you go out with a group of your wife's friends and you're a jerk. I mean, you don't get it. And it's not because you don't want to get it, you just don't get it. And they're in some professions. Somebody in my office who used to work at Hewlett-Packard for a long time, he said, these people are common in computer industries. What if you have hormonal disorders? Could that affect a relationship? Well, we know depression doubles after puberty, after a woman has a baby, right before the onset of her period, after menopause. Those are all times she's vulnerable to depression. Well, what happens if there's not a lot of psychological mindedness going on at home? And it's 5 days before the onset of her period, and she's throwing stuff at you. And now you have a cingulate gyrus problem. So you now have thought about the fact that she's thrown that at you for 12 years. You're still talking about it. So you can see how brain patterns can collide. Now when we see PMS, we actually don't see one pattern in PMS. We see sometimes their cingulate's hot, sometimes their limbic system's hot, sometimes their frontal lobes crash, sometimes their temporal lobes crash, and sometimes they have all of those things, which can be a problem. So an example, and these two scans are from the same person. If you look at healthy time of the cycle on the left, worst time of the cycle on the right. So their brain really drops with low estrogen levels. And look what happens to her cingulate gyrus. So frontal and temporal lobes drop, cingulate gyrus flames. You do not want to be home. Better to be in Philadelphia. Heck, better to be in Cleveland even. All right, what about substance abuse in the brain? Now, we have this sense that people who have overactive brains use substances to calm them down. They use alcohol, they use marijuana, they use opiates. Do you think if you're chronically using marijuana that might have an impact on your relationships? Now, but what do you think about this? Because this is something I hear a lot, is their wife goes and buys them the pot. Because if they don't, he's terrible. So they're medicating an underlying psychiatric illness. Maybe anxiety, maybe depression, may have something to do with their temporal lobes? I don't know. Or what about people who have cold brains that medicate with methamphetamines or cocaine? I have to tell you, of the murderers that I've seen, and we've scanned 50 murderers, 40 of them committed the crime while they were using meth. Might make one nervous. But substance abuse relationships are very hard. And the issues often is then they have children because of the impulsivity, lack of family planning, if you will, and then grandma's raising the child. Very common. All right. So we talked about these areas as areas that could get couples in trouble. So prefrontal cortex, judgment, impulsivity, attention, cingulate, rigidity, have to have your way, limbic, issues with depression and negativity and no sexual interest, temporal lobes, auditory processing problems, temper, basal ganglia, they're anxious. So Gary Larson helps us. There's this couple, they come to see the B therapist. You guys are 2B therapists, right? These are B therapists. And the wife B says to the therapist B, listen, I've tried to communicate with him, but he's like a broken record. None of your beeswax, none of your beeswax. And you get couples that have two cingulates together, they just come and fight. And nothing you do seems to make a difference because they're over-focused on the issue. Now, how did I get interested in couples? This is the first couple that I ever scanned, 1991. They came to see me because they had two children that had ADD. And I evaluated the kids, and the little girl had ADD, inattentive, little bit of medicine, she's great. Good school interventions. Little boy had ADD and oppositional defiant disorder, and nothing I did for him worked. And I saw him in individual psychotherapy just to see if I could get a better grip on what was going on. And what I figured out is he wasn't getting better because his parents hated each other. And I was much younger then and more confident than I am now, maybe. And I thought, well, just see the parents and fix them. And so I told the parents that I thought their relationship problems was really the issue for this little boy and that they needed to get better. It's at this point, they didn't tell me anything about this ahead of time. At this point, they told me they'd seen 4 other therapists and that therapy usually made things worse for them. And, you know, being that I'm a graduate of Vanguard University, I have this little arrogant streak in me. And I thought to myself, well, maybe they just didn't see a really good therapist. And so I took it on, and they saw me every week for 9 months. And in my office in Northern California, I have 2 blue leather couches. They sat on the opposite end of each couch. This is a bad sign in marital therapy. And I saw them every week for 9 months. After 3 months, I hate them because nothing's working. You know, this woman has a PhD in grudge holding. She's beaten stuff to death from 15 years ago. And she's married to a guy called the Sniper because he never paid attention to what was going on. But periodically when she would settle down, he would say something so awful, so evil to just get her going again. And I feel stress in my stomach and in my neck. And whenever I would see them on my schedule, I would start to feel sick. And at 6 months, I want to call in sick. Because my biggest flaw as a therapist is I want you to get better. And I don't want it to take 5 years. That's me. And, you know, and by 9 months, I remember this like it was yesterday. I'm taking a shower, getting ready to come to work. And I realize they're on my schedule. And now I'm furious because they're in my shower. Because now I don't feel well in the shower. And I'm telling myself, well, today I'm going to tell them to get divorced. Now, I was building a case for this because 1, they're not getting better. I'm the 5th marital therapist they saw. 2, it is not helpful for children to live in families with chronic conflict. And so, anybody else here besides me grow up Catholic? Very Roman Catholic. I was an altar boy until I was 19 years old. And so I get this thought in my head, today I'm going to tell them to get divorced. Only the Catholics will understand this next part. The Catholic voice comes to me and goes, "What? Because you're not a good enough therapist. You're going to tell these people to get divorced and damn their eternal souls to hell." Because when I was growing up, getting divorced was like a mortal sin. And so now I'm looking at the faucet going, how much therapy does it take to get over this? And I get out of the shower, I dry off, I go to the phone, I call my friend at the imaging center and I go, can I have 2 scans for the price of 1? And he goes, why? I said, I have this couple I can't figure out. I'm not helping them and it's making me nuts. He goes, Dan, you want to scan a couple? He said, you know, I've been married twice. I can't figure women out. I said, I think this is a great idea. It's probably a good business opportunity too. He said, we could call it brainmatch.com. So we scanned them, and what we saw are the images of the woman who has the cingulate gyrus from hell. Now, what that did for me personally is I started to have empathy for her. See, I disliked her almost as much as her husband did, because like nothing worked. But now I'm like, whoa, back up. She's got a brain problem that you missed. And when we scanned him, his frontal lobes were gone. It's like, oh, he has ADD. How'd I miss that? And so I put her on Prozac and him on Ritalin. And didn't see him for a month because I needed time to recover. And when they came back, it's no lie, after a month they sat on the same couch. First time they sat on the same couch. And she had her hand on his leg. It's a good sign in marital therapy. And you know, it's 13 years later, they're still married. I mean, how cool is that? Right? Let's get more information. Well, what if you have a couple like this, where they're both cingulate? There's not a lot of sex in this house. And as you'll see in a minute, that's a significant problem in relationships. They fight all the time. They hold grudges. They constantly say no to it. You know, when somebody's finally in the mood, the other one's like saying no. Or if you have a toxic couple, one person had drug abuse, the other had a brain injury. These couples find each other a lot, and they end up at social services. They end up in marital therapy, and it's not great. But if you know it, 1, you get rid of the toxic exposure, and 2, you work to rebuild the brain. This is one guy who has a condition called alexithymia. Alexithymia means I do not have access to my own feelings. What do you feel? I don't know. He was sent to us by the marital therapist, and actually his wife was sent to us because she had a terrible temper. And what we found is that her temper was because she could never get a reaction out of her husband. And so she escalated. And when we scanned him, he had damage to his left front left temporal lobe. And on treatment, he did much better. I mean, that was sort of the exciting thing. Doesn't mean they don't need good psychotherapy to help relearn new patterns, long-term potentiation. Now, what about medicine in couples? Do you think medicine can have an impact? Psychiatric medicines are very common. A lot of the clients, patients you see will be on psychiatric medications. Well, you know, you have to, you know, if you're fair about it, you realize medicines are positive and negative. They're positive because they treat illness. They're negative because sometimes they have side effects. I mean, as we've talked about before, if you have bipolar disorder and they give you ADD medicine, well, you may get flipped into a manic episode and have an affair, spend money, and your wife divorces you because she has a cingulate gyrus. She can't understand the medical part and won't forgive you. So you see how the brain can interact. Give somebody the wrong medicine, it can ruin their life. Medicines have side effects. SSRIs decrease motivation. They also decrease your libido, decrease your ability to have an orgasm. Now, if somebody's not talking to you about it, and we have things that usually fix that, really can do a negative thing on a relationship. Stimulants can cause people to be overfocused, to pick their skins, to have more acne. Anticonvulsants, anti-epileptic drugs, so that's what AED stands for, anti-epileptic drugs, can cause problems with memory. Antipsychotics can cause you to have diabetes or gain weight. I mean, it's just important to not see medicine as a panacea, that medicine is really a double-edged sword. All right. I love this research because many people withhold sex as a way to punish somebody else. What they don't realize is they are in fact punishing themselves. Regular sex with a partner, according to research out of a couple of different universities, research done by women, not men. Regular sex with a partner, women had more regular menstrual cycles, more fertile menstrual cycles. They had lighter periods, better moods, better memories, helps with pain relief and bladder control. In addition, women who had more sex had less colds and flu because we think it increases their immune system, reduce stress, help them keep in shape physically, increased a hormone called DHEA, which has been known to help keep people young, increase the hormones testosterone and estrogen, which help keep their libido up. That's pretty good in weight control. If you look, that vigorous sex burns about 150 calories per half hour, yoga only 114, dancing to rock music 129, walking 153, and weight training 153. Well, what would you rather be doing for half an hour? Well, what about for men? Well, according to a 1997 study published in the British Medical Journal, study done at Queen's University in Northern Ireland, they tracked 1,000 middle-aged men over 10 years. The findings that were men who reported the highest frequency of orgasm enjoyed a death rate half of those who didn't. So, this could be a life or death issue in your life. Brand new study. Sex actually increases something called heart rate variability. Heart rate variability goes with heart health. Also goes with brain health. Increased sex was involved with increased cardiovascular function. 3 times a week decreased your risk of a heart attack or a stroke by half. Boost testosterone, so you have stronger bones and muscles, increase prostate function, sleep, and overall would keep your testosterone levels high. There's this thing called andropause. As your testosterone levels go lower for men, your mind goes lower as well. All right, couples in the brain. Shared caring for the brain, so how you eat should matter. You want to love your partner's brain, so it means you want to feed it right, take care of it, protect it, exercise it, make love for it. Okay, is this brain for you? Are you looking for the right partner? This comes from Sarah Gilman, who's a therapist in Encinitas, who's very familiar with my work. You want to know that he or she is in their right mind. So the quick and easy guide on how to recognize if a potential partner has a healthy brain. Well, the brain matters, and the outward expression of the brain, which is their character, which is character, choices, and consistency. She calls it the 3 C's of the prefrontal cortex. The healthy whole brain creates the possibility of a healthy whole person. Watch for the choices he or she makes, how he or she treats others, and then how he or she talks to you about them later. What do they do with their children, their friends, their coworkers? How do they talk about them? How does he describe his past relationships? Does it sound like he or she is in recovery and healing, or blaming and stuck? So, know thyself. How is your brain today? The question is, if somebody has a parent who has a hot cingulate gyrus, does that mean the child is doomed to have a hot cingulate? No, it means the child is more likely to have a hot cingulate, and if they've taken this really cool course, They'll figure out all the ways to settle it down naturally. If a parent has the cingulate gyrus problem, and the child has it too, would it come genetically, or would it come from being modeled? The answer is both. It could be either. Clearly, if you have the genetic tendency for it, and we adopt this child completely out and they have totally normal parents, the child is much more likely to have a cingulate gyrus problem. Now, living with somebody who has a cingulate gyrus problem, they're more likely to be emotionally abusive. And the trauma is likely to fire what you already have up further. But now remember, I mean, you get stuff from both parents. One may have a cingulate gyrus problem, one may not. So you may get a little or you may get a lot. You might not get anything. So anybody have a better understanding of their spouse? Of the person they were thinking about being their spouse? We had a discussion on the way over. You know, if you're dating somebody, should you get them scanned? I don't know. See, I think it's just information. I mean, if they have a big hole in their head, this may not be the person you want to have offspring with. But it may be. You know, I mean, if you saw the movie 50 First Dates, I mean, actually, it's very sweet. You know, and nobody's perfect. Right? I mean, if you're looking for the perfect brain, you're in big trouble. CNN did a story with us, CNN International, and the anchor came out. Her name is Marina Colby. And we scanned her as part of the show. And drop dead normal brain. I was so sorry she was married. I was so sorry she was married. All right, I'm over it.